Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event tonight, Public Art, Who Decides? My name is Catherine George, and I'm delighted to introduce the debate tonight, which has been organised by the MA Curating Programme at the Courtauld Institute of Art. This is the second of two debates that our course organises, which address topical and pressing issues in the museum sector. Together, we have chosen a subject and questions which our chair and speakers will discuss for around an hour, at which point we will invite the audience to submit questions via the chat, which our panel will answer. Although the vast majority of debates on art are centred around works displayed in museums and galleries, our conversation tonight will focus on art in the public realm. Millions of people interact with public art every day, whether commuting to work or walking in a park. Indeed, public art is often so enmeshed in our daily lives that it's easy to overlook. However, last year's Black Lives Matter protests have pushed questions around public art to the forefront. From the toppling of Edward Colston's statue into Bristol Harbour to the controversy over Cecil Rhodes' statue at the University of Oxford, the topic of public art is not confined to the art world, but has permeated the wider discourse, dominating many of our news headlines. Tonight, we will continue this live and ongoing debate by looking at who decides which artworks are installed in the public realm and how communities have responded to these public artworks, both positively and negatively, to find out how we can create public art that communities accept rather than have to tear down. Above all, our panel will address timely questions of our ownership and agency to define the public spaces that we inhabit. Our speakers tonight are all experts in excitingly diverse forms of public sculpture. Firstly, we have Eleanor Pinfield, who is Head of Art on the Underground, an organisation which commissions artworks on London's Tube to enrich the daily lives of commuters. Eleanor is also a member of the 4th Plinth Commissioning Group and sits on the Mayor of London's Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm, which was launched in 2021. Eleanor is joined by Joseph O'Connor, who is the founder and artistic director of Circa, a platform dedicated to showcasing digital art in the public sphere on London's Piccadilly lights. Rather than using public space for commercial interests, Circa's 2-minute daily displays highlight how public art can be a refreshing break in a cityscape that otherwise often bombards us with adverts. Sarah Carrington is the Head of Strategy and Partnerships with The Line, London's first dedicated public art walk, and she primarily focuses on building audiences and increasing engagement, as well as artistic and strategic direction, cultural partnerships, and development. We are also joined tonight by the artist John Mayne, whose public sculptures can be encountered across the world from Scotland to Japan. His sculpture Arena, situated on the south bank of the Thames, is a powerful example of how communities can achieve a sense of ownership over public art. The event will be chaired by Harriet Seeney, a professor of art history at the City College of New York. From co-founding the journal Public Art Dialogue in 2008, the only peer-reviewed publication dedicated to public art, to sitting on a multitude of advisory committees, Harriet's scholarly work in the field has been prolific, and her thinking has greatly informed our approach to the debate tonight. So without further ado, I will now pass on to Harriet, who will introduce our speakers and start the discussion.
I was thanking Catherine for the introduction and the invitation to participate in what for me is an international perspective, since like most New Yorkers, I'm extremely geocentric and my participation in panels has mostly been here. So we have a number of questions, I think, that will help us approach the various perspectives that Kat introduced. And I want to start with this notion of what our panelists consider the best patronage practices. And as part of that, how do temporary projects fit into your thinking? So I thought we might start with Eleanor, who has dealt with some temporary projects, to be sure.
Hi, thank you, Harriet. It's lovely to be here. I think temporary is a really interesting and important point, but in that we can sometimes fall into within public art to think about statues and sculpture as a sort of principle in sort of public dialogue interventions. And I am really interested in what it is to be non-figurative, non-permanent, and encroaching into public space in really varied ways. At Art on the Underground, we work principally in temporary projects. Probably about 80% of our work is on temporary work, and about 20% works on larger scale permanent interventions, that is intervening often within station structures for new developments. So sort of large scale integrated artworks, which comes with a much longer lead time, much higher cost. I think what I find particularly exciting for me working with artists on temporary project is the way in which you can really capture contemporary art practice and what that means in its really varied ways with artists right now. I also think, of course, it gives you that ability to engage with current issues in a lighter way, perhaps a more reflective way. And I am also interested in the traces left behind by permanent works, but I think there's a different kind of there's a different level of, there's a different sort of engagement that can come from temporary work. And the other area that I work on with the fourth plinth, I think is a really interesting example of what temporary but monumental sort of contemporary art can do to discourse, to social discourse, and to thinking around what public art means in public spaces.
Yeah, I think the fourth plinth is an exceptional example. In fact, it was suggested here in New York after it was decided that the Theodore Roosevelt statue in front of the Museum of Natural History should be removed, although it hasn't been, that maybe what they could do there in order to spark some constructive, or maybe not say constructive, dialogue was something like a fourth plinth example. But so far nothing is happening. Joseph, arguably all your works are temporary, right? 2 minutes.
Correct.
I mean, do you think of them that way?
It's quite interesting because I suppose what's interesting about our platform is that there's a duality between the physical experience and then the website. Whenever I'm commissioning artists, I always say to them that there's going to be far more people looking at the work online than there will be standing in Piccadilly, especially when you're going through a pandemic. You know, on New Year's Eve, we had about 1 million people tune in to watch the Patti Smith piece, which you wouldn't be able to fit into Piccadilly. So in that regard, it's not temporary because the work exists forever online. I can go onto our website now and go back to the archive and scroll through the works. But in terms of the actual conceptual prose in which the work exists, yes, it's temporary. And I think that what is always inspiring for the artist about that is that to give an artist confinement and to give them kind of restriction is kind of a gift, because I think it then creates the ingredients to be able to kind of twist and turn and to find ways to then actually push the boundaries and push the limits. The first example we had with that was how Ai Weiwei, rather than just making one work of art that would repeat throughout the month on, you know, in the way that David Hockney did with The Sunrise, he created a sequence of 30 films that told the story from 1971 all the way through to the present day, and that transpired as 30 individual works of art that paused the adverts. In terms of its kind of like, you know, being a temporary disruption, I think that's at the core of really what we're doing as a new media platform. And I think that is also reflective in the fact that, you know, I always talk about the fourth plinth, because the beauty, you know, of seeing all the applications come through is that we're very different in that, you know, we're currently working on finalizing a work for next month. And you just wouldn't be able to work at that timeline if you were working on something with a more permanent, you know, cast bronze confinement of how it's manufactured or how it's made. And I think that the digital factor, in terms of this being temporary, provides the artist with a really great amount of freedom to then also create work that is a media as well as being new media.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. It's not only freeing conceptually, but also in terms of materials. Of course, those things are related, right? Yeah. Sarah, do you deal at all with temporary, or I'm not quite sure how the line works, so forgive me.
That's okay. So I will tell you more. The line, actually, the majority of our works are on loan from artists and galleries and collectors. So the majority are on loan for around 2 years. Some have been on the line for a lot longer. The Gary Hume we've had now for 9 years on the line. So often the loan period is extended because people have been happy with the reception and happy with how we've looked after their work. So many of the works exceed the 2-year limit. And I guess we have also now recently started to commission work which is much more temporary, or not I mean, you know, experience on a different level. Like, for instance, the Larry Acheampong audio piece, which was our first audio commission, which we realised last year, which I was going to come on to speak about a bit later on. But yeah, I guess in that instance, it was about experiencing the work through, as you said, Joseph, through a digital platform. So it will exist on our website even after it's been experienced. Predominantly, audiences experience it on the cable car going over the Thames. And his work was actually developed in response to that specific site. So it was a really exciting opportunity, as you know, Joseph was talking about, in terms of having artists respond to the site, to the context. So we have those kind of approaches alongside the loaned sculptures, which are, you know, the original concept for the line was really about bringing works out into the public that would otherwise have not been and would have been hidden away. So it's kind of that idea of bringing the inside outside. So we have monumental works, but they are temporary, many of them.
Yes, and I don't want to veer away from this notion of best patronage practices, because really most of the works in the public realm, I think we could agree, are still permanent or intended to be permanent. And I'm wondering if in your experience, John, you had some very, you know, good experiences with patronage practices, or if you want to talk about the negative, I guess that's okay, as long as we're talking about.
Well, it's very good to be with all these people who are involved with imaginative and progressive projects and temporary ones, and a great deal of flexibility. I work predominantly with stone, and it doesn't move, or I hope it moves you. And I make things which stay in one place for a very long time, and it takes me quite a long time making them. But I'm most interested in what happens when a work does stay in a place over a long period and encounters all sorts of different uses, and people come to it with different experiences. I mean, there's this question of whether people resent work that suddenly appears in a place that they love, and I'm rather against doing that. I think working in a place and working with the people who are in the place over a long period means that they are much more likely to understand what you're about. And I mean, Arena on the South Bank, which was the piece that I was asked to talk about in this context, is something I made as an exhibition piece, actually. There was an exhibition at the Hayward, and I said I would work on the South Bank, and I would start the work at the time of the exhibition, but I wasn't sure when it would be finished. And 2 years later, it was finished. We brought 200 tons of raw material to the South Bank, to a point where barges had brought it in the past and in the 18th and 19th centuries, and made a work there, and everybody could see it being made. And so there was never any question of what are you doing interrupting our space, because they could see something evolving in front of their eyes. So, I mean, I obviously, like everybody else, I've had many different experiences where people have been aggressive, but I tend to look for the situation where it can evolve and be part of people's experience while it's made as well, because I think the process of making something is terribly important. But that works for me because I'm shaping stone, which is an interesting process. I think some of the more obscure processes probably do happen behind the scenes, but I'll leave it to others to talk about those.
I think that, you know, you raise a very interesting point that sort of segues into our next question, which is, how do you think the public should be involved? And you're actually suggesting one way to involve them is to make them, what would you say, witnesses to the process? Is that fair?
That's absolutely, yes. And of course, I mean, in other terms, you involve people through discussing the work, having exhibitions, showing them what you're intending, getting their feedback on that. But I think seeing the actual practical engagement is very unusual and to be sought. I've several projects that have worked that way. In fact, mostly.
I think, I think that's important because people who aren't involved directly in this art process or world sometimes think these works magically appear and there's not like a, transition between, yes, here's a person with a material shaping something for us to see. So I'm wondering, in terms of public, how do you think the public, or in what ways do you think the public should be involved other than the one we just mentioned? I know I had an experience in New York, and I won't be particular specific here, but it was one where a public art administrator tried very, very hard to involve the public in every aspect of the choice of the subject. The public here was defined by those people who came out and seemed to care. Sometimes it's a community board here. And when it came time to making the final selection, and the selection committee on the art commission didn't pick the one they wanted, the hostility was unbelievable. It cost somebody their job. It cost the selected artists to withdraw from the project and give the community what they wanted. And the reason I'm bringing this up here, and then we'll come back to this later, is actually the work they selected was aesthetically and conceptually less relevant, or we can't even say inferior, to what the selection panel actually had chosen. So I'm really wondering, how do you think, in what constructive ways the public might be involved? Does anybody want to jump into that?
I mean, sorry. I was just going to go back to the Larry Achimpong work, which is Sanko Time, where we actually, he, as part of the process of his research into the work, he worked with a local school, and this was all done during lockdown, but he actually, he was able to get audio recording from the kids through workshops, and it was all happening during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, and he was asking the children to actually record a mantra or to kind of reflect on how they'd want to remember what their testimony would be for the future. The idea that the audio they're leaving is for people in the future to listen to and understand what we were living through. And they recorded as a group, "We are one, we are the same." And that became then part of this very layered audio work, which you listen to on the cable car. And I think that was kind of an extraordinary process where during everything, during all of what was happening with the lockdown, we were able to engage local people in a work that then they can experience, which is on their doorstep where they live, and it connects to the history of where they live and the issues that they're going through and living through at that moment. So that was quite an exciting opportunity. But I think what you're talking about, Harriet, in terms of the process and who you have to engage in order to get permission to do anything. I mean, the line, we negotiate with something like around 11 different landowners along the route. We cross through 3 different local council boroughs. So there's an awful lot of people who are involved. I think that's one of the most exciting things, is when you're talking to people whose day-to-day job has nothing to do with thinking about art or artists. And then you're in a room with them, trying to get them on board and trying to help them to understand what's going to be involved and taking them on that journey. I mean, they're still the public in some level. Their engagement in the process is an interesting collaboration, I think, as much as the wider community and residents. So I think there are sort of circles of engagement that need to happen, and all of those points of encounter are pretty challenging, but really, really rewarding as well. So.
And then you also have circles of a sense of ownership, right? Because they were participating. Eleanor, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think this is such a kind of at the nexus really of some of the thornier issues around public art, because and you almost sort of getting into what I sometimes think of, Harriet, as like the quality debate as well, like what is of good quality or not in public space. But I think it is really important in public art. I do, being one and sitting with some others here, there is a role for a curator. And I think we have to understand what a curator's role is, especially in public art commissioning. And I see my role as negotiating all of that in step with the artist. And artists have different ways of working and want to engage. John's given some examples there, the examples from Larry Achimpong working with school children. Every project that we do at Art on the Underground it's about the depth of site-specific commissioning. And that means you're going to be reacting, responding to people in different ways. And for some, that might be in a very kind of very direct way, and others it could be looking at archives, it could be looking at research, it could be how we present works back. We include people, often they might be used by the artist. Linda, the wonderful punk artist, did a residency with us for 18 months. You know, it's slow. I think actually that means a lot to me. I mean, I know Joseph talked about digital art being quick, but I think there is a lot. People can't believe that all of our projects take about 18 months to 2 years to get somewhere. And it's because doing it properly, slow site-specific commissioning is how you get that level of, you build up trust with your audiences or with local station staff, people in the area. You know, it has so much depth to it, as well as as I hope, an exciting aesthetic outcome. And I think with something like the fourth plinth, you know, it's interesting you said, Harriet, should we do it in New York? Almost everyone I meet now, you know, even if we talk about a wall, they say, can you do the fourth plinth on that? Can we turn that into the fourth plinth? It's become because it's become so well known internationally and successful. But maybe this is not so often thought of, you know, controversially. It's become that renowned because of how it's been curated over the years.
Yes,
and because there's been quite a lot of flat, you know, that obviously everyone, the Daily Mail will say they hate whatever goes up, but there is that ongoing tension. But it also gives these incredibly rich outcomes that I think are really persuasive when we're trying to say, what's the value of public art? To me, it's not just enough to say, you know, we work with a local group, or we did, like, it's got to be the whole package. You know, it's got to fundamentally say something and move you. And that's where, you know, that's a curator's job, working with an artist to allow the artist to do that. You know, that's our job. It's hard and there's lots of boring stuff, but then there's that exciting creative outcome.
And it's all part of a longer dialogue because people remember what was there before. Yeah. And I just kind of want to underline what you just said, Eleanor. It's about curating. We use that expression here. I'm not sure if it's the same for you. Typically, when we refer to museum curators, we use it less often when we talk about public art curators. And I think the responsibility is very much the same.
I think there was a bit of a difference with North American and UK. Certainly, I hear public art administrators use quite a lot in North America, the kind of term. But I think here in the UK, we tend to use curator from some of the other big, you know, Art Angel, other alongside The Line and others, you know, that we're talking about that do big public art work. I mean, I still think, and we will probably come onto this, you know, it's still an argument, what is public space, and, you know, what is a still sort of hosted art event. You know, I sometimes make the joke, like, are you doing an artwork in a disused car park, which might be really fashionable, but we kind of do artwork in the actual functioning car park, you know, with the cars still coming in and out. And there's that sense to me that that's where you're getting these unexpected audiences and interactions. And that's what I find particularly exciting, not just outside of a gallery, you know, not just that, it's more than that.
And Joseph, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the public involvement in your process. If that's relevant.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I created at the very beginning of the project, because, you know, this launched in October with Ai Weiwei as the program, but before that we did 2 months whereby we gave space over to graduates whose shows had been kind of cancelled by you know, all the repercussions of the pandemic. And when it came to kind of building the architecture for how the project was going to work, it was a constant awareness to the fact that this was a public project and that there was a kind of a responsibility, both in terms of the time being given, what that represented, and also symbolically what it represented in terms of the responsibility to the audience to kind of provide a contrast to the capitalist space that is normally used to sell, to ensure that the work was actually offering a perspective or offering an insight that carried a value that was potentially greater than what the monetary kind of significance of the space equated to. But the part that is separate to the program that I'm most kind of proud of, which we weren't really sure at all if it was going to work, is called the circular economy. And it's really about this idea of a circular system, whereby we put on these shows on Piccadilly. We've now also got permanent presence in K-pop Square in South Korea and in Tokyo in Shinjuku Station. And taking this kind of platform and converting it into essentially revenue that can then support the program and support the project, but also support the wider community. So the basic way that works is that we sell prints every month by the artist who we're showing on the screen, and we sell those for £100, and then we then circulate the funds back into supporting the program, but also then giving away cash grants to, we call it direct to community like support. So that means that we're then able to actually, through the platform, through this public art exercise, first of all, involve and invite the public to be part of it by owning a piece of work from the actual month, but then actually for that money to then circulate back out into actually supporting the wider community too. So rather than just kind of being taking, it's actually giving back as well. And so I find that exchange something that, I mean, we sold 3,000 David Hockneys last month. So in terms of like how it's working, it's something that I'm really proud of.
It's a really interesting project, and it's certainly a good indicator, just as you said, Joseph, of whether people like something, right? If they're willing to.
That's the fascinating part. And actually, some of the notes that I wrote down here, if we're going to stay on the topic of David, like the public response to the roundel that he did in the train station at Piccadilly was fascinating. I mean, if anyone here hasn't heard about it, then I just get a cup of tea and go on Twitter, because it's really entertaining. And the reason why I think that it's, in terms of like public interaction, for me, it's connected wider to the art education in society. And I think that coming back to this idea of the curator and of public involvement, whenever there are these kind of like these huge disparities in taste or between what is deemed good art or bad art, if we're going to go down this kind of like Grayson Perry route of like, the classic standard of art, let's say, then it just comes back to education. And I think that the biggest piece of public art that we can give to society is to educate young people to actually have an opinion about art that is well-rounded, that also doesn't exclude them from being part of the conversation. And I think often or not, people feel excluded by art. And then when you put that into the public space, it's like a double whammy. So I think that the challenge, especially that I feel when curating Circa, is how can we, as you so well said, Harriet, is that, last month we were showing David Hockney. This month we're showing Nikita Gale in collaboration with Chisenhale. And I really champion, and I'm always excited by these kind of like these rhythms in the month, so that maybe one month, you'll get into the Daily Mail because it's David Hockney, and then the next month there'll be a completely different dialogue, but then the value of what you're communicating or the work will have a completely different perspective as well.
I feel like I need to just pipe up a tiny bit on that, given that the David Hockney appeared on the tube. It was in Piccadilly Circus Station, and I mean that had a few red flags for me, I have to say, and I think it's probably worth saying it wasn't an Art on the Underground project. It was, although it was shown on the Underground, and that can be quite tricky, because I think it's quite in opposition to the way we try and commission, which is not slowly to the point of saying dully or like ponderously, but thoughtfully and carefully in terms of what's the screen, what's the space, how does an audience member see it, would they see it in a repeated way, what does that mean in sort of communication terms, and doing sort of very quick turnaround, repeat it lots of times down an escalator, lots of white space around it. Like, to me, there were a few things that I feel could have been done, that not so much that what David did wasn't a good thing, but like maybe the way in which it got up. I don't know. I think that's interesting. And I think it's really interesting. I'm really interested in what you said, Joseph, and that there's like a wider economy, but also when you've got that economic capitalist, relationship going, like, what does that mean in terms of which artists get shown? Because obviously an artist like David Hockney has a lot of cut through and people, will buy that work, which is really interesting. But, what does that mean? I mean, I guess what you'd say from what you just said is that it's sort of funding then more emerging artists, but how that kind of comes into, I guess, the model of commissioning, and coming back to the point I made at the start, often it's really interesting to think of how artists are being selected, you know, who's funding the projects, how the maintenance, where the maintenance comes from. So these kind of questions are quite interesting ones, because they end up having quite a big effect often on how one programs. And I feel unbelievably lucky often that within TFL we have a sort of regular budget with which to consider future program, to think about which artists we want to work with, and to do a lot of risk taking, because I think that's really interestingly what it comes down to often, the sense of risk taking without knowing what the outcome is often. And I think London Underground has a really interesting history of that I often point to when people think what we're doing is mad, from its early work in the 1910s and the 1920s, working with some really avant-garde artists at that time, you know, leading Bauhaus figures like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Man Ray, you know, artists of that complex, you know, challenging way to our history at that time. So I find that really kind of invigorating to how we think about sort of challenging situations, I guess, through that security of having a long-term model, which I think is really important part of the public art landscape, as it were, terrain.
Yeah, I think the range of process is really probably a good thing, and certainly a provocative thing. I wonder if we could segue a little bit also to the range of audience response. And I'm wondering whether any of you have any methodologies for doing this. I have a very hands-on way when I teach public art. All the students do a public art watch during the semester. They pick a work of public art. We develop a short questionnaire, and they engage with several dozen passersby at different days, different times of the day, and come back with, you know, sometimes there are very surprising conclusions. Early on when I started this, I never expected to hear, for example, and this would have to do with a permanent work, the homeless were great advocates of public art because they spent more time in that space than anybody else, and they really appreciated it. So I'm wondering whether any of you have ways of measuring. You talked about one, Joseph, you know, if somebody buys something, they like it, but there's a range. I also encountered, I had a student who did a study once of watching 100 people at Lincoln Plaza watching the Henry Moore, most of whom said they didn't know it was there, they paid no attention, yet they all went out of their way to sit near to it when there was no, you know, no trees there or anything. So, you know, there's this kind of somatic response. I'm sure we've all seen sculptures where some parts of them are, you know, kind of rubbed off. So I'm wondering if any of you have, you know, developed ways of gathering this kind of range of audience response from, I'm going to buy this, I'm going to throw it in the river, you know.
Well, I'm on a learning curve all the time. On the South Bank, we were there, as I said, 2 years, and so a lot of people came past, and we had all sorts of different things happening, including sort of performances from the National Theatre and the embryonic sculpture that was being made, and people walking through to the city from Waterloo Station, stopping by the chestnut paling fence and sort of seeing how we were getting on, and becoming friends and seeing the evolution of it. So they were very good. But then at the end, a chap in a city suit came past and he said, you know, it must be very disappointing for you. You've made this work, it's a beautiful work, and yet there are children there skateboarding, sitting on there, having their sandwiches and frolicking around. I said, well, actually, that's pretty much exactly what I've been doing all these 2 years while we've been making the piece. And I don't really mind them doing that. They are engaging in it physically. They perhaps don't know, but it's, why are they doing it there and not somewhere else? So that was a form of communication for me. Yeah. I think I said to him, well, it's fine because, you know, at the end of the day, they will go home and you can sit on your seat and you can have your serious thoughts contemplating the curves.
That's nice. Sarah, you were saying before that you kept some works, you know, longer than the 2-year period because. I was wondering what constituted the because.
It's varied. I think on the whole, it's because the people lending the work are really happy with how it's been received, or, you know, sort of to realize they can share their work with a much wider audience than they would have been able to otherwise. So, and it reflects the fact that they're happy with how it's been maintained there and looked after. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of actually hearing from people, we have an enormous challenge. We have a 3-mile route. We have no entrance, no exit. We have no staff physically manning the work. So we're a tiny team. So we do rely a lot on hearing from local partners, hearing from schools and organizations we work with locally. Social media has been amazing, particularly during lockdown. We've had some incredible responses from people who've never walked the line before, or who've been desperate to find something close to home and haven't been able to go to museums and galleries, and have found the line has offered some sort of sanctuary, because it's not just about the artwork, it's also that you're walking along waterways, you've got extraordinary wildlife. It's a kind of escape from the city, from the noise around you. So it's provided something quite extraordinary for people during lockdown, and it's been lovely to hear that from social media, because obviously we couldn't necessarily even be there physically ourselves all the time because of, you know, being locked down. So yeah, so social media has been an enormous platform for us to be able to hear from people. I mean, like for instance, with Reaching Out, which is a sculpture by Thomas J. Price, which was installed last year in August. We've had people taking selfies or mimicking her. She's a 9-foot-high sculpture, a bronze sculpture of a Black woman, and she's standing looking at her phone. So it's kind of the idea that she's either maybe reaching out for something on her phone, or she's reaching out for connection with other people not on their phones, or you know, it's an extraordinary work which symbolizes a lot of different aspects of current life, and people responded to it very powerfully. People left flowers at her feet. Again, she was installed just completely coincidentally just after the Colston statue was removed, and obviously there was a lot of debate at that point about who decides and who's represented. And Thomas talks a lot in his work about growing up in London and you know, going up to central London and never seeing a Black man represented, but seeing plenty of white men raised up on very high plinths. And his work has always been about, you know, redressing that balance and looking at how his work can broaden representation. And so I think that through social media we've been able to hear a lot from people locally about what that work has meant to them on lots of different levels. So that's been very exciting. I mean, I guess I'm very conscious that we're sitting here as a very white panel talking about these topics that you know, have affected us but not affected us in the same way they have many other people. So but that was a really useful platform for us through that work, to hear from people.
You want to go back just for a moment, something I meant to ask before, and I think it was prompted by your comment, Joseph, about the importance of education. I know at least of one public art program in the States that really made a concerted effort to embed visits to public art in the educational system, starting from a very young age, you know, kindergarten even. And it seemed to me that that was a very I mean, you need a budget, you need an education for part of a public art program. And I'm just wondering whether anything like that, do you know of anything like that exists here? That's just a quick question. Because I think that that's a very you're building your future audiences, right? I mean, that's the point. And also you are, in a way, if you can say this, kind of cutting into the practice we have in public art of people staring at their cell phones all the time. In that audience watch assignment I told you about, I once had a student who wrote back to me, I watched 100 people walk past the sculpture and only look at their cell phone. It was a quite sizable sculpture. So that seems to me a very positive thing we might be thinking about. But does anybody have any experience with that? Otherwise,
We've done a little bit. There's a little bit of that. There's something called the London curriculum that the Mayor of London creates, and we have sought to be within that curriculum to think about how young people, particularly at younger age groups, might sort of get involved and look at the art around them. And obviously, being on the Tube, we have art in quite a lot of spaces all over the city. And there's one project that we did with Mark Wallinger in 2013 called Labyrinths, which is an artwork in every station, all 270 London Underground stations with a unique work. So that was one that we put a particular effort working with all 33 boroughs of London to do activity in each one of those boroughs so that people could feel that there's something they could go and see close to their houses in not quite everywhere, but in most of London where the Tube runs, to go and see some art that was for them. And I think Labyrinth, that project, to go to the previous point in sort of how do you form how do you see if things are successful? That's been a really interesting project. I didn't actually commission that. That was before I came to head up the team, but reflecting on it, there is such a passionate group of people that love that project. They are all over Twitter all the weekend long telling us if one's got a sticker on it, if one's been damaged. You know, they are owning the work more than we can because there are 270 sites. And it is so sort of rewarding to see how much that's taken on, that it's decentered almost completely into this huge sort of fan club, people that like to go and photograph every single labyrinth as a project, and they tell us how they're doing and they update their spreadsheets on the weekend. So they hate it when we take one down for refurb work because then they can't photograph it. So it's this really sort of ongoing dialogue with, and that's an interesting sort of, that's a small scale permanent work that's decentered across the whole city. And I think that's actually a really interesting sort of powerful other example of what permanence can mean, you know, as opposed to the plinth or the statue, but still having a physical long-term presence.
Yeah, really serving as a connector, a civic connector. Can
I just add one thing very quickly? Sorry,
oh,
just we're about to launch a new program called the Line Youth Guides, and we have a deadline of next week on the 18th. And if it's open to people in 18 to 20-year-olds living in East London to join the line as guides, and they'll be trained up to speak to the public and also to talk about their own ideas and responses to the work. So we're actually, that's the first time we've done that, where we'll have people stationed on the line talking to the public and also very much listening to what they're hearing. But we're really keen that it's also about young people giving their perspectives on the work. It's actually inspired by a project I worked on a long time ago with Mary Jane Jacob in the States, where they were called youth docents over there. But so yeah, that's, so if you know any young people who are interested, who live in East London, they can apply by next week. So yeah, we're very keen to get that up and running and directly, you know, connect with people locally through that program.
I think that's terrific. The Whitney had something like that for a while, the Whitney Museum, and it was extremely successful. When I was going to,
I think on that temporary versus permanent thing, I wondered, I mean, I really like, sorry, I just throw it in, I won't make a big point, but I really love the example of Munster. So Public Sculpture Munster, that does that, you know, that real interweaving of permanence and temporality in there. I mean, they only do it every 10 years, but that sense of doing that very slowly, but building up a city. For those of you who don't know, Munster has a sculpture festival every 10 years, and they commission temporary works, but a number of those works over the decades have become permanent structures within Munster, and it's sort of building, and I just love that sense of sort of building up history, and that is in a large part related to how people react to them and how it sort of beds into the city. And I love that sense of both experimentality and permanence and history and leaving traces that comes with that model as well. I just think it's really beautiful. I'd love to be doing that in the UK.
yeah, I think that's Go ahead, Joseph.
Sorry, Harriet. What I would also just add is I was really inspired by what Hannah Barry's doing in London with Bold Tendencies, and they also have a program whereby they champion 12, I think it's 12, so my details might be out of date here, but kind of candidates each year that they then put forward for mentoring, but they also kind of, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but like in Peckham in South London, Hannah has this kind of, like, I guess you could also call it temporary in a way, because it's seasonal in that it's, you know, back to the car park point, Eleanor.
I wasn't didn't mean that one in particular at all. It's just like no,
it just came to my mind. Yeah, but it's the most incredible view, because from south of the river you have no kind of like disturbed skyscrapers that can kind of, you know, break up the view. So you have this amazing, beautiful panoramic shot, kind of similar to if you're in Greenwich. Sorry, in New York, Brooklyn, sorry, looking over at, you know, Manhattan. And what Hannah's done in the local community in Peckham, and how they actually are finding ways to bring people into the dialogue. As we said, like, this is a mainly white Zoom talk, and I think that those are the barriers and the obstacles that we as a community, as an art world, have to be conscious of and try to kind of like change and to, you know, adapt. And I think that one of the things that when I think about public art, is that the public conception is that it needs to have a plinth, is that it needs to have these kind of like, you know, that it needs to be made out of certain materials, or that it needs to, and I think that what's, for example, like amazing about what Sarah's doing is that, you know, it's taking people it's taking art into their day-to-day. You know, I have almost all my friends walk the line during the pandemic, and it was just providing them with something that was, you know, bringing art into their daily routine. And I think that the challenge is, like, how can we find ways to continue to break down that fourth, like, you know, that fourth wall, if we call it that, and you know, invite people into the discussion, but also invite them into the debate?
I think that is really the question. I was going to move us on to something that's been in the news so much here and almost everywhere, which is what should be the criteria for removing a work of art. One thing that's been suggested, I know, it, at least in the context that I've been working at it in, is if the reason you commissioned it is the same reason you want to take it down, it should probably go. So that would work for Confederate memorials in the state, right? That's pretty clear. But most of the things that we deal with in terms of controversies are not so clear. So I guess part of that question should really be, do you think a work of art should ever be removed? And if so, what do you think the criteria should be? And let's make it even a little more complicated. What should you do with it?
I think when works appear in public, they're very often, there's quite a large percentage of people who resent them or don't like them. And then after a while, they get used to them because people are not sort of too excited about having change at that moment. And then they reach a point where if you took them away, the same people would be complaining about you taking them away. But I think if it never reaches the point where somebody would complain about it being taken away, that perhaps is a time to start thinking about whether it's belonging there any longer.
You mean almost in the sense of whether or not it has a shelf life for that particular community?
It does, but then of course materials come into it as well, because some things can just simply endure and stand there until another generation or future people will see something in it. But I think you're talking about works which have an iconic connection, which will be changing because of changing political circumstances.
Right, and changing demographics even within a specific area, certainly.
I think there's a really interesting point. There are so many things we could say here. I think, we are an art group, so are we talking about artworks, or are we talking, I mean, this is a really, what's an artwork, really open discussion, but you know, if we're talking about monuments, are we talking about artworks, are we talking about recognition? You know, I think for a lot of the artworks, you know, the equestrian ones that take up a lot of kind of our space, people don't even know who the, you know, who's the art. It's not really about an artist statement. It was about a statement of power as they were being put up. And I think that's really interesting when that changes how you might structure a debate around that. I think it certainly has become, I think everyone would probably agree, oversimplified in terms of the kind of pull it down or leave it up. I think Colston's a really, the statue of Colston in Bristol was a really interesting case because there had been so many attempts to make changes to the plaque, to contextualize for decades. And I think where the frustration comes from is that there's actually can be an inertia that means that nothing will ever change, that kind of, as I see it, led to what happened with Colston, with it being pulled down more dramatically, because every single avenue had basically been closed off, the sort of reasonable avenue, you know, the going through the council, talking about new plaque. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, that we put up sometimes, I think, a faux dialogue over how communities might want to express discomfort or frustration with certain pieces. Our government now says retain and explain is their kind of official policy, but you know, that's really challenging again, and it would be interesting to see if there were there's going to be some guts for the first people to put up a new plaque to someone next to it, or recontextualizing in public space, I think, where it's particularly high profile. I think the point on art is another really fascinating one, that, as John was getting in, which can be how artistic tastes change. And I think that's a really that's probably not what you're asking, Harriet, but certainly I've seen that with works that were commissioned on London Underground for a long, from the past, that in terms of fashion, they have been liked and disliked differentially over time. And some artists come back into fashion that weren't in fashion before. So Edoardo Paolozzi did a very famous work, and he wasn't necessarily beloved when that work went up. And now he's a bit of a grandfather of British pop art, and he's seen quite differently. But the work maintains, and I think as a curator, often that's our job as well. And to everyone in the audience saying, but you pulled down a load of Paolozzi, just to say that there was a huge restoration project of Paolozzi with one section removed, which is another interesting challenge about what to do when you're taking down a ceiling to which an artwork is connected, which is going to crumble and fall apart, a physical challenge to how you deal with the fact that public spaces change over time, as opposed to an artistic challenge, which all of these we could have separate debates on. That also as a curatorial decision is a really complex one in terms of how you manage amendments to artwork over the very long term, over the kind of 50, 100 years plus time period.
Yeah, and I think those are really important distinctions, Eleanor. Thank you. I was thinking about monuments or memorials when I was raising the aesthetic issue that I sometimes abbreviate with what's art got to do with it. Again, this was an issue in New York with the Theodore Roosevelt Monument, because it turned out to be a very good work of art. It was made by Augustus St. Gaudens, chief assistant, etc. But typically, I think when we deal with monuments or memorials, art is the last thing anybody thinks about, and subject is, almost exclusively it. That said, changing styles with works of art that are not monuments or memorials is also really, really fascinating. I wonder whether any of the rest of the panelists had experiences with that they might want to share. Because we do have more questions, and we don't even have so much more time. So, put it on the back burner. You can always chime in later. This was raised in the intro, and we haven't really addressed it yet. And I would frame it with how, in parentheses, should works of public art be protected from vandalism, from unwanted behaviors, from what? I know that we had a couple of works in the States that were for a while guarded by military or police. I'm not seeing that right now, but that seems to me a particularly bad message to be sending. Have any of you had to deal with that, where you felt there was a work of art that needed somehow to be protected? Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, just to kick off, the piece I've been referring to all evening is actually in the Arts Council collection, and that's quite unusual because it's curated by the Arts Council. I think it belongs to Lambeth, and it's there in the street, and it's very much something you fall over as you walk along the road. But if it wasn't curated, every time it gets a bit knocked about, it would sort of lose bits, and they do look after it actually. And so I think it's quite important that somebody cares for a work, and the best people to care for it are the people who love it, of course. And if there's a small community that has a work that they're very proud of, they will look after it. But in big cities and so on, you do need somebody taking care, if only to wash the pigeon stuff off them and kind of clean them up. So that's rather a practical answer. I'm sure other people will have more philosophical answers, but curatorship is quite an elaborate business and starts with physical care.
For sure. I know there are some programs, again, in the States where they do surveys perhaps annually or less often, depending on the budget, just to go around and check on the condition of works of art. But I see that we are running out of time, and I really want to get this last question in there for each of you. What do you consider the most successful work of public art you've created or commissioned, and why? Or least successful could be interesting too, but I won't ask that. I won't ask you to respond to that. We can maybe do that later. It's like asking you to pick your favorite child. I know. We try not to do that. Although, we all have favorites.
Well, let me just give one. I think
Yeah,
I think Catherine has a picture of it, which is an earthworks on Portland in Dorset, and it's a series of stone walls. And I made it on site in the same way, about the same time as Arena, but completely different. It's just simply Portland stone set out in a series of walls that reflect the stratum of the stone on the island. And it was quite difficult doing it at first. People said, "What are you doing, changing the hill?" But eventually they came around, and now everybody walks there and loves it. And well, I think they love it, and it does get maintained. So I have a very, very personal attachment to it, and it's my heart is with it. So I would say that's the one I really love.
it looks really wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I know some of the others of you have spoken about projects recently you thought were successful, but if you had to put one in a show, which one would it be?
I feel like I've already spoken about it a lot, but it would be for me the Larry at Chimpong, because again, we were able to connect with local archives and museums, worked with the Museum of London audio collection. And I think also just because of the way we had to, Larry and I, we met and had studio visits, and then lockdown happened and the rest of the work had to be produced and developed completely remotely. And as we've all found, it's been extraordinarily challenging, but also amazing to think what's been possible through that time. So we were able to launch the work, and he was able to collaborate with the school, even though he couldn't go there because he was shielding, and we were able to work with archives, even though we couldn't go and visit them physically. And so that felt pretty amazing to be able to do that, and to know that it's there and people have enjoyed it and are listening to it still. Please all listen to it. It's on our website, and it's also, if you listen on the cable car, it's a pretty profound experience. So,
well, it's sometimes interesting, like a serendipitous process, which results in something totally unexpected. Joseph, do you have one or a couple you'd like to pull out there, or not so much?
We're actually working with Larry next month, so which is going to be really, he's wonderful. To be honest, the thing that came to mind when I read it is that my friend Norman said to me, "You're only as good as your next show," and
that's right.
And I'm always chasing that next show. So I don't really have what I would say. There are really beautiful. The thing about every artist is different, and I think being an artist and then working with an artist is such a different experience. And I think every artist should be made to curate a show to learn how not to be a nightmare. And I think that there is, and I think that there is something really special about every collaboration and every commission. So it's always really difficult. I often do think about, like, with regards to Circa, like which month would be my favorite, but they all have such different highs and lows and challenges and obstacles. So I would say my answer to that would be the next show.
The next show, I like that. For me, it's the next book, right? We all have that kind of. I imagine for you, John, it might be the next project. Eleanor, what about you? I mean, you worked on the plinth and a bunch of other things.
Joseph's totally ruined, obviously, but me now wanting to say something, because something that we've done in the past. But there's one sort of sub-program that we've been doing that I found it so enriching and so enjoyable, and a slightly new way that we program that I just wanted to mention. I do have a slide of it, actually, if we could bring that up. And it's a site we've been doing at Brixton, so Brixton Station, very sort of important part of British London history in Brixton, big Black diasporic community, post-Windrush and Black British, as well as many other people living down in Brixton. We've been working there now since 2018 on a program that has responded to the idea of muralism. And you might also know that there are lots of murals created in Lambeth, mainly in the 1980s after the events, the riots, the events of those years. And we invited a series of painters really to respond not directly to the murals, but to the idea of collective memory and nostalgia and place. And you can see there, the bottom right actually was the first work we made with the brilliant Nigerian artist Njideka Akinili Crosby. which picked up on kind of the Windrush scandal themes. It's the most beautiful painting, followed by Elisa Nissenbaum on the left, who's a Mexican painter, very inspired by Mexican muralists. Denzel Forrester at the top right there, who's a British artist, who particularly referencing the kind of 90s, 80s and sound system work in his work. And Helen Johnson, we've just launched the new work with, who's a painter from Australia. And we will be working with Joy Labinjo later this year to do a further iteration. What I find so enriching is not only that I find the paintings themselves so exciting, but that I love playing with that idea of multi-layered work in one place. So this has been over the last 2 years, but for people who use that station on a regular basis, what I think it so wonderfully has allowed us to think about as a public art program is that sense of layering, and that layering of meaning and perspectives and views, which is what's so exciting about temporary art programming as well, that one artwork doesn't do everything, but doing this as a series that takes as its idea community, nostalgia, place, and works with unbelievably wonderful painters in that kind of, how are they using the material of paint? It's just really exciting to me, and I've really enjoyed it, and we will be continuing it for a bit longer. Yeah, so that sense of multi-layering and how that affects the public who use it, I think is something I'd like to think about more in the future.
Keeps it visible also, right?
Yeah, variety is good.
Way. So I'm thinking that we're ready to go on to audience questions. Is that right, Kat?
Yes. So we have a load of questions that have come in from the audience, which are really exciting. So first up from Stephanie, she's asked regarding engaging the public in commissions. What do you all think about using focus groups compared to kind of a wider public base, as like in deciding which works go up, and how do you involve the public, and how best do you think you can achieve representation?
I just want to interject. I think that's a really good question, and it sort of underlines a question that I'm asking a lot, is how do you define community? Who is your community? I can tell you that, you know, if you live in an apartment building in New York, you might not even know everybody on your floor, right? So what community are we talking about? Or if you work in a university, you know your own department, but you might not know the department down the hall. So who is the community for a work of art? And then how would you, in fact, define a focus group? So those of you who are commissioning maybe can expand on that really good question.
I think who's local is a really, these words like local, community, what do they mean? And I sometimes find the most common thing someone will say to me, if they don't work professionally in art commissioning, like it's a particular thing a politician will say. They'll say, can you please work with a local artist? And if it's a local artist, it's like, tick, we've ticked every box and everything will be great. And that always really intrigues me, because I always think, well, what does local mean? And how does one voice represent a local area anyway? You know, what does that actually mean? But it's, so I find it actually, well, sometimes people say, why do you work with artists that aren't British? Or why do you work with artists from abroad? Or, and of course, to me, it's about London, and it's about the vibrancy of London, and how it, 40% of people living in London weren't born in the UK, like all these really interesting things that means like, what is a local, what is a community? And that doesn't really answer the focus group point, but I guess it's a little bit, I think it's dangerous sometimes to pin too much on a subset that says this is local, or this is the community, or this is everyone's opinion. Sometimes you have to do the work. And I think we've talked about that a bit between us, you know, going out and doing the work with artists that you're commissioning in terms of bedding it in, explaining what you're doing, bringing in voices, informing the project, I guess is more my kind of way. The fourth plinth does interestingly have a public vote aspect to it. You can vote online from the maquettes, which informs the thinking, and it does inform it a lot. It's really, really interesting, especially when you get big numbers like that, to see how people are responding. But it's a bit of a luxury to have a maquette, to have a model made of a proposed artwork. So that probably isn't realistic on every project that we might commission.
You know, there's also the question of, does local mean lives in an area or works in the area? because you can have people working in area from entirely different parts of the globe. And then the other part that has come up for me in a couple of panels has been people who have a certain knowledge about a subject matter. Let's say it's a memorial, who knows something about Black history at this point in time in this space, right? Clearly not everybody does, but it's important to have some kind of representation of some kind of informed individual. Maybe that leads into the focus group concept. Anybody else want to jump in? Or Kat, we can go on to the next question. I hope we answered that a little bit.
Yeah, we actually have one for John specifically from Linda, who asks, your work seems to me to be highly responsive to context. Is this the key to successful public art rather than something which people might see as an imposition, so that the organic qualities of the pieces are just as important as the evolution of the construction?
Well, yes, you have to deal with the context. You'd be foolish really to make a work and not think about the context, because contexts change pieces of work. One of the reasons I was most interested from the start to make I make sculpture, but to do it out of doors, is because wherever a sculpture is out of doors, it seems to be different in different places, different light, different seasons and so on. But there are also the social contexts, of course, and what people do in a place, and particularly the history of a place, which is the context we inherit. So yeah, I think you'd be foolish to embark on a work without considering context, but you also have to cut through it and use imagination. So it's a balance of sensitivity to the context and imagination to see how different that context could be presented, how differently. Maybe the others have better answers. They all look nonplussed.
Sounds like an answer.
I was just going to add, I think there is actually something to be said for things being a surprise as well. I do think there's something. I used to commission art in a hospital, and I did lots of consultation and spoke to lots of clinicians and patient groups, and for a long time before anything was installed. And then often people who'd never even been spoken to about it were the people who were most affected or got the most out of it. I think the same with the line. People will come across things they hadn't heard about coming, even if they live locally, and they might be confused or intrigued to begin with, but often over time they build up a real connection to the work. So, and we've had that experience where people locally have asked where something's gone when it's been, a loan's come to an end, or people have built up a kind of affection over time, but they might not have been involved in the original selection or consultation at the beginning. So I think there is quite a lot. And I always think about that example of, not that it's we've all got our own opinions, but it's the Angel of the North, when it first came up, and there was such a huge response locally, and people were and the press went crazy. And I think the press, it's so interesting how the press goes so crazy in this country about public art. Perhaps not so much now. I think Fourth Plinths has done a huge amount to change that, but often that you'd never get such an extreme response if it's a building that people don't like, or it's a I'm always interested in why art creates these extraordinary responses. But the Anthony Gormley Angel to the North, when was first installed, had this outpouring of people so angry about it, and locally people fuming. And then I think it was after about a year, some people got together and put put Alan Shearer's shirt over the figure. I thought it was quite an extraordinary way of it. Sort of, they were reclaiming it as their own, or showing what it meant to them, or I don't know. It's kind of one example, I suppose. But I think I do think there's something to be said for things happening and people discovering them, and that being transformative.
I think what you said is quite interesting as well, because that's a pre-social media narrative of a public reinterpretation of a work, like throwing the shirt over the Angel of the North, and it reminds me of something that somebody said to me a few months ago, that there's nothing happening in galleries, everything's happening in memes on Instagram. And it was quite interesting that memes are the new public sculpture, and that there is this kind of way to disrupt or to engage or to be participating in by actually getting your phone out, ironically, and creating something in response to. And what I will do, Eleanor, is just loop back into the point earlier about the Hockley, is that the thing I found beautiful about it was that it did encourage people to get creative and to start making. And so in a way, the jury and the panel do exist. It doesn't necessarily, the question is, does it need to be before the process or after the process? But the interaction and the engagement is alive and well. And in a way, to break into becoming a viral meme is almost like the final pinnacle of, you know, being given a sort of a blue tick on Instagram for a conceptual work, because, you know, Tracy Emin's bed would have 100% been given the same treatment. Or like, you know, there are works throughout history that, you know, would the urinal have also been, you know, manipulated into a viral meme. And so I kind of feel like the panel aspect that we're talking about here, the question is like, does that need to exist at the beginning, or is it okay for it to be also exist at the end, as long as the dialogue is still, you know, participatory into the work?
I think it's really interesting.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think I really love that argument that social media and meme is the new public space. I think I love it, and I also think, but there are loads of things that I think, but you know, I guess the sense to which it gets an emotion. I think one thing that maybe but I'm not a super online person, but the pace of change of meme sort of based discourse, and that one day it's this, next day it's like it's moving, and it's kind of an exhaustion. So I guess that's really interesting to me as someone who personally has found like such great passion with art through, you know, slow reflection, or things that like have that emotional connection. I'm really interested in to the extent to which then something that you very quickly see on a phone, like it does create an emotional, we know that because that's what all the algorithms do. They're trying to make you angry, or they're trying to make you, you know, they're trying to trigger an emotion. But whether it's that, the extent to which, and I mean, I haven't worked this argument out in my head, I'm just like thinking aloud really, like the extent to which that's what an art experience is. Like, how would we define an art experience? And we might, if we were feeling pretentious, think about a kind of change of perspective, or an emotional, or a sort of building of knowledge. And you could equally argue, well, that's exactly what a meme does. I guess I'm just interested in that argument, really.
I'm sorry, you could say it was something to do with bringing together opposites. Stephen Hawking, who's further ahead in all of this than I suspect any of us, is buried in Westminster Abbey, and I had to do the stone for him. And that was an extraordinary sort of task to take on. And he's buried, his ashes are there. I made the stone, and it was installed there. And the stone had to be for his family. It had to be for all the scientists who understood what his work was about. It had to be for all of us who understand where he is in our sort of mythology. Perhaps the artist's role is to try to bring some of these things together and make a mixture that works. I hope it does.
We have another question from Malcolm, who asks, it's an interesting contrast to a lot of the ways that I guess all of you work in public sculpture, which is very, I guess, legal. But he asks, how does the panel feel about Keith Haring, the self-curation of public art? And I guess that mention of street art raises the interesting idea of public art that is perhaps not officially commissioned through legal channels, or that is just put up by artists. And do you think there's a space for this kind of illegal or unsanctioned art in our cities, or do you think art should always kind of go through those public channels?
I think many great practitioners have I don't think you can be an artist if you don't have an interest in space, you know, and in that sense that you might want to intervene in varied ways, whether we're thinking about photography, filmmakers, performance art, I mean, that kind of is, again, a definition, I think, of what an artist is. So I don't think any artist would ever say they want to be constrained by a certain type of presentation. It's quite interesting how I might shift over a career. I work closely with Daniel Buren, the French artist, completing a work with his at Tottenham Court Road. And Daniel started off fly posting stripes all over Paris in the 1960s in a very kind of interesting practitioner of those times in challenging everything to do with painting, canvas, gallery, structures. and yet now is one of the most feted public art artists in the world, has projects all over. So that kind of shift from total outsider to total public fating is really interesting, and it hasn't changed. Fundamentally, he still has the same eye and the same belief and the same fascination with space and how he wants to intervene in it. It's just sort of happening in a different way. But I think street art, I guess, is so much of its DNA is from that. It is not only that it is outside and it is not done, but that the sense of it being like a illegal act, you know, in so much of the or actively not supported, you know, in terms of how people make it, the emotion of the work itself being like voices that otherwise aren't cutting through in urban environments. I think I don't think it should ever stop. I don't think it will ever stop, and that's good. I think will be the super simple.
The beauty about the Keith Haring as well is that often he would be working with chalk, so there was this, you know, temporality to it that is also romantic, because the work, you know, with the brush of a hand could just, you know, disappear. And you've got to think about the context of the city as well. Like, you know, New York at that time was a very, very different place to what it is now. And of course, you know, you had then a different pandemic wiping out the city. So the need to be seen and the need to be kind of visible would have been so different, to have your voice kind of like break through. I think that was one of the things that I found really beautiful about the time throughout the pandemic with lockdown, especially the first lockdown, was just like how much public art, you know, especially fly posters. There's an amazing company called Jack Arts who actually give a lot of free support to, you might have seen some of the white pube posters about kind of reimagining a future art world appearing throughout the city. And I just think that like any attempt to try to, you know, bring a perspective to an audience that is going to kind of inspire. I'm not encouraging people to break the law here, but, you know, to find ways to actually, you know, engage with new audiences should be welcomed. And I think it makes our cities more vibrant and more exciting to live in. And, you know, the irony is when then those works obviously get protected and covered in perspex and then treated as landmarks, there is this kind of conflict in our cities between expression and vandalism. And it's, you know, understanding, do we create space where we celebrate and we allow? There's a road just up here from where I live, and it's an area that, you know, people are allowed and encouraged to go to actually do spray painting, and you know, it's totally legal. But I feel that, ironically, despite the fact that we're living in a digital age, there is still this, like, I feel that we're living in this kind of like golden age of street art per se, in terms of like how people are then actually embracing new mediums on the street.
Thank you. We have a question for Eleanor, and it is asking, how can work on the underground, for example, best be accompanied by text or other curatorial interpretation?
That's an interesting question. I think it's a challenge, because actually often spaces that we're using to show work might be surrounded by other advertising forms. So it's not, you know, there isn't necessarily a dedicated space of here's the art. It changes by station. The Brixton example I showed you, I suppose, has quite almost a gallery for us, almost like a picture frame, single location. We work to put interpretation close to all of our artworks in the station, or where there is a larger piece, but there will be an extent to which some of them, we work with the great artist Laura Provost, and part of her project was a sort of series of posters that got distributed across the network, and will have confronted people with her style of sort of witty, challenging, philosophical, almost white text on black background. And I love that sense of happenstance that happens. I think it is then an interesting question, you know, do people know that they're looking at art, or does it matter that they know if they're looking at art? Might be a more interesting question. Does it create a response, I guess, would be what I'd be intrigued by. and whether people want to go and find out more. I think I love the idea of spreading. I mean, it's a bit going back to, you know, Daniel Buren and his stripes across the city. That's, he put loads on the metro. In fact, that sense of wanting to infiltrate spaces and come up with something that perhaps subconsciously comes formed in your brain. Some people I talk to about Mark Wallinger's Labyrinth Project, they've never heard of it, but then I talk to them a little bit and they say, do you mean those circular things I see everywhere? And I say, yeah, that's what I mean. And it's subconsciously, for some people, you know, in their brains. And Mark, in that case, was very clear that he didn't want interpretation next to those labyrinths. He wanted it to be almost folkloric, a sense that people, you know, that it, especially as a permanent work, that it grew and grew over time with sort of people knowing about it or coming to it in different ways. So that it can, to be a more direct answer, it can depend what the artist wants. It can depend on physical requirements, but I think it comes down to that really interesting fundamental question. Does it have an effect? Does it matter that it's art? And how might we measure that? Which is almost impossible, but I guess is what we're constantly, maybe like Joseph, the next one, you're always trying to do it even better, like the next project in public space, in terms of intervening and exciting people in a way they might not have expected.
Yeah, we were talking for a while in New York about possibly using QR codes when they first came out as providing the option to link to more information right on the spot. Of course, QR codes are long gone. But I kind of like that idea of not putting the literal label right there, but if somebody's standing there and maybe wants more, it's sort of inobtrusive.
We have QR codes.
Sorry.
We have a digital guide that you access through QR codes next to the artworks, and you can listen to audio by the artist talking about their work, or we have meditations you can use while you're walking the line, or yeah. So there's.
Do you find them popular? I'm really interested in that, because I always wonder the extent to which, you know, a bit like we keep saying we're trying to do site-specific commissioning, sort of intervening in natural cycles, the extent to which people would do, you know, it's almost like, what's the equivalent of that on a phone? Like, it's not quite scanning a Q, you know, is there a more sort of natural way when people are already doing, I mean, I don't know what the answer is to that, but I'm really interested just generally in whether people use QR codes frequently next to sort of heritage art sites.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been a fan. I always think they just look really ugly and they're clunky, but I guess now we're using them, aren't we, every day to go get a coffee. You have to scan a QR code at the moment. So I think they've become much more familiar. I think, I mean, for us, the digital guide just also allowed us to access audiences who maybe have never been to the line, and for them to encounter and to have and gain interpretive material and to sort of get a sense of it. So I think that's also been a really useful platform for us. But we've always had physical signage next to the works as well, and then the QR code has just been added to those. But we also rely on people maybe planning ahead and having downloaded the app before they start. But I think some people just want to experience work without any, you know, interpretation, and others really love to be able to have lots of audio and to have that kind of layering as part of their experience.
I think we might have time for one more question, which might be a good way to sum up, which is, how do you get public bodies which are not really interested in art engaged? And I think this might be especially a good question for Joseph and Eleanor and Sarah, perhaps, when you have to convince perhaps people to give you funding, or convince sort of areas and specific councils that they need a work of public art, or for example to give up space in Piccadilly for art, or to give up space on the Underground for art, when that would be an incredibly profitable use of space for someone else. What arguments do you use to validate the value, I guess, that public art will bring to that area?
I'm happy to respond if no one else is ready. I guess for us it varies. Some
Big
people.
question, sorry.
I think it really varies depending on the relationship. Some partners will approach us. You know, some landowners will want to be involved with the line, or, you know, actively seek a relationship. And I suppose in the crudest sense, sometimes that's about marketing and wanting to, you know, promote the area they're developing by its cultural affiliations and by the value that brings to their brand. Or it's also about people like the Royal Docks team, who are a really big partner of ours, and they recognise the impact the line has in sort of connecting places and connecting people, and on potentially, you know, providing a support for people's well-being, encouraging people to be active. So they maybe are more invested on a community level, as well as, I guess, again, the connections and affiliations to other partners locally. So I think it really varies. We also have lots of cultural partners who work with us more, you know, on developing projects and collaborations. So I think it varies hugely, and I think that, to me, that's the most exciting part, is when you're trying to knock down a door and say to somebody, look, this is project, you've never heard about it, but we want you to be part of it, and to convince them that, you know, connecting with art is something they're going to gain from their stakeholders and their partners. And so that's the kind of idealistic scenario. It's never quite that straightforward, but
I actually understood that question in a different way, which was, how do you keep people engaged with a work of art once it's up there if they're not interested in art? And that would have to be through, you know, public events, programs, etc. It's easy with a memorial and anniversaries. It's a little more challenging if you're dealing with a work of public art that's not that. But I don't know which way that question was meant. But it is something that we have asked ourselves a lot in New York, because often a work goes up and it does kind of become invisible.
I think within TFL, when we try to justify it, I mean, we basically justify our existence every day in various conversations within a non-art organization. And I think, you know, that there is the utopian that I believe passionately, that I think we provide different perspectives on the city, that we change people emotionally as they're traveling through stations, and creates an emotional connection between customers, as they like to call them within TFL, customers and their stations. And I think when we take a step back, you know, some of the things, if people might be annoyed by their delayed journey, but for some people, you know, it's the poetry program, Poems on the Underground, the art program, it creates an incredibly emotional connection actually between the public and Transport for London as an organisation. When that doesn't work, I also try to remind them of the fantastic heritage, and that we still live off that now. So London Underground, TFL is the fantastically beautiful organisation it is, thanks to a load of artists and a very visionary leader in the early 20th century who designed the roundel, the typeface, the font that we use, brought in artists. You know, the design history, the art and design history of London Underground is phenomenal. And that is what makes one of the reasons it's so known around the world. You know, the roundel is the most famous logo probably in the world. And that's because we brought in artists. And that's what I try and say is really exciting now. If we're talking to outside people, then there are different arguments. But yeah, that's maybe for another day.
Thank you so much. I think we might have to wrap up, but thank you for such a lively and engaging discussion, and also to everyone at home who sent in such thoughtful and provoking questions as well. I'd just like to take a moment to thank Layla and Acacia at the Research Forum, whose hard work behind the scenes makes all of these events run so smoothly. And we would also like to express our deep appreciation for our tutor, Jackie Klein, who is leading our course this semester, for all the help that she has given us in formulating the topic of the debate. And finally, last but certainly not least, we would like to extend a massive thank you to our speakers, John Mayne, Sarah Carrington, Eleanor Penfield, Joseph O'Connor, and our chair, Harriet Seeley, for being so generous with your time and your expertise tonight. It's such an honour to hear about the many different directions that public art can kind of go from here, from people who are so embedded in the field at the moment. And although public art has arguably been sort of more divisive in the past year, sort of your answers have given us maybe a bit of hope for how public art can enrich our lives and relationships with others, and also foreground the ostensibly democratic concept of the public sphere. And public art is actually a central part of our upcoming exhibition, Both Sides of Here, Artistic Encounters at the Threshold, which is going to launch on the 16th of June. And as part of our events programme, we do have a map of public sculpture throughout London, and we will be hosting a live dance performance at John Mayne Sculpture Arena. And it will be an open air event on Thursday, 24th of June. So yeah, it's completely free to attend, and we'd be honoured if you all came. So until then, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we hope you all have a great rest of the evening. Goodbye.